Today called LTE, Answers Beyond the Obvious, and it's brought to you by Baicells. In the presentation, you have any questions, enter them into the Q&A box that you can see in the bottom right portion of your WebEx platform, and those at the end. Now I will speaker. President of Baicells Technologies. He has extensive experience in the disruptive LTE, 4G, and WMAN fields and of the wireless broadband industry, and especially championed for pushing broadband into rural markets for 20 years. Mr. played instrumental roles in steering the industry from his work on the FCC Spectrum Policy Task Force in shaping new spectrum rules, of mixed spectrum frequency model for unlicensed operators, and introducing North American fixed wireless operators for LTE. Thanks for not just seeing trends, but for being a catalyst for them. Ms. has been a guest speaker from Stanford Law School, the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, Virginia Tech, and countless trade events, spectrum forums, and economic development conferences. Now hand over the presentation to Patrick.
And thank you to the NTCA for hosting this webinar. I hope you'll find the content useful. This is not a rah-rah session, and we're not going to really be talking much about technology so much as we will the importance and the impact actually of LTE in particular, especially within the context of some recent developments from the FCC. My name is Patrick Leary. I'm president of Baicells Technologies North America, Inc. We're a subsidiary. Our parent company is over in Asia. And the things I wanted to get out of the way is, you know, when I'm listening to someone, I always want to know if the voice is credible. We all have opinions, but frankly, some opinions are more valuable than others. So I usually look for some sort of justification, whether the voice is qualified. Excuse me. I'd like to page for that. So from the corporate level, corporation, our company was founded by an interesting guy who was what they called one of the 12 fellows at Huawei, which is one of the top guys there. Rather young age at the time, at 44, before he left the company, a year before retirement. So that I think it's a roughly $65 billion company, which has made substantial strides, not just in Asia, but also throughout the rest of the world. Telecom, from handsets on over. But our CEO, Li Xing, was instrumental really in driving the in-country competency in cellular over there. So he's led many of the global scientific and standards-based organizations that have been driving LTE. So everything from Working Party 5 is the LTE work group for global telecom. There's out there listed, which is 3GPP's work group. I believe it's 3, which relates also to LTE. He chaired the Pacific LTE work group as well as China's own standards bodies. So he's pretty well known in the scientific communities, and he went on to create this company because he really believes LTE can truly be disruptive and be kind of a democratizing force inside telecom. From the international and from the LTE standpoint, on our end, for myself, I've been in space for a long, long time. True work is relatively siloed within fixed wireless, and then going back earlier into wireless LAN and then optics. But I was at the very first meeting when the FCC chief staff was introduced to fixed wireless broadband before they ever knew it existed. Previously, they just considered these things some Institute of Wireless LAN Technologies, and they weren't aware that people were doing commercial broadband services using these technologies. In the years, I worked with them to help open up new spectrum for the space, and that leads us a lot to where we are today. Let's put it here. So there's here that really forms the basis of my argument, or if it exists, there is no argument, I should say. There's a new piece of spectrum the FCC has defined and released in their report and order on April 17, 2015, CBRS bands, which is an acronym for the Citizens Broadband Radio Service. Now, this piece of new spectrum has been percolating ever since really President Obama got into office, and he instructed the FCC and Commerce to find 500 megahertz for rural services for wireless broadband, and then it's what was called the PCAST. And as a result of that, in December of 2012, we issued a report, an NPRM, which is a notice of proposed rulemaking. We listen, we've got an idea, and it basically said, we've got this existing piece of spectrum that we're using from 365 to 37, and in fact, a fair amount of rural telcos already use this, as do a number of utilities for internal stuff, and a lot of these entrepreneurial wireless internet service providers, they're also using spectrum. However, the FCC says, there's 100 megahertz right below that, from 3.55 gigahertz to 3.65, ostensibly controlled by the Department of Defense, but in reality is really used in a very limited sense, principally for naval radar, and that mostly related to coastal areas, and even then, only used episodically as ships are nearing port and this sort of thing. Of course, they won't tell us exactly what they use the radars for, but we do know, because we can see it on analyzers, that is very sporadic and sparse. So that being the case, this administration, the FCC had a chance of pulling spectrum out of the DoD's hands, at least to the extent of getting them to accept some sort of shared spectrum management regime, which is something that's really never been done before. In NPRM, they asked a lot of questions, and then over the course of the next couple of years, they had lots of answers from including NTCA filings and others, on input on how that band should be shaped. And then on April 17, 2015, they issued their final report and order describing this kind of how it would work and how long it would take to implement. The crux of it is it opens up about 100 megahertz of brand new spectrum in kind of virgin spectrum territory. And you expect this to be kind of operational in 2018 because the FCC has left it up to industry to create some of the management mechanisms. And when I say that, the FCC has decided on a spectrum management regime that is truly revolutionary. This is something they've never done to this scale. They've done it in a limited sense in what they call TV white space, which some of you may be familiar with. But this regime calls for the development of what they're calling an SCS, a Spectrum Access System. They call it the board. I think it's a lot simpler than that clumsy acronym. But the idea is that all the base stations, access points that use this particular new piece of spectrum will plug to a cloud that will connect into this board, which will then manage the spectrum environment in real time based on 3 levels of prioritization in terms of usage of the spectrum. The high level prioritization would be an incumbent user, would primarily would be the Navy, but could also be some satellite operators. The second tier would be this thing they call a priority access licensee, which they call a PAL for short. someone who buys rights to a 10 megahertz piece of that 100 megahertz spectrum. And the final tier is what they call GAA, which is General Authorized Access. A particular tier, there is no specific protection offered, but essentially you're just operating kind of like operators do in the 365 realm today. Was everyone registered themselves on a database, everyone is able to know who is up running nearby, and then simply this board will, to some degree, try to manage the interference environment. Although its principal responsibility is to move people away from the priority access licensees to protect their operations. So unique in the sense that there's 10 megahertz license that you, NTCA member or municipality or anyone else can actually pick up at an upcoming auction for, in some cases, maybe a couple $100 for a 3-year lease. Why could it be that cheap? That spectrum traditionally is something that costs billions of dollars, and the last time there really was an NTCA relevant auction was way back in the 700 auction days, and most of us remember when it came to the E-block, and snatched up all that stuff. And only 16% of all NTCA members were able to pick up any 700 megahertz spectrum from that auction. I figured that represented some degree of a crisis. But this is a little bit different. Instead of the licenses being kind of super regional, there are actually 7 of these PAL licenses, or PALs, in that 100 megahertz of new spectrum. Each one of those licenses is basically protected access rights to 10 megahertz. Now, typically, these are divided up by census tract. And it's never been done before. Frankly, I'm not smart enough to figure out the science for how they completely keep someone out of someone else's census tract. That's what the scientists are left trying to figure out. But the result is there's something in the area of about 77,000 census tracts. So census tract, there are 7 of these licenses. So you do the math and realize that's a heck of a lot of these licenses. And in a very rural area, say it's, Cheyenne or something, one census tract may encompass an entire county. A very urban environment, say downtown Dallas or something, could be a little more than, per mile or less. In New York, it could be a couple square blocks. But the thing in the rural areas is a really good chance that business tracts should go very, very cheaply because there'll be 7 of them. And the reason anyone wants them at all, I can kind of explain on the next auction, on the next page. Yeah, that's not the way to do it in this thing. Here we go. So this spectrum was extraordinarily interesting. You have lots of potential stakeholders who want, for a myriad of different reasons, in some cases completely non-overlapping reasons. For example, the large cellular carriers, they're very interested in this spectrum, and if you were to go back and look at the public comments they posted, from mobile to Sprint, many of them are ferociously interested because they want this spectrum in deep urban, high-density areas so they can do cellular offload because their precious billion-dollar spectrum is getting hammered by Netflix streaming and these other kinds of applications. So consequently, their traditional cellular spectrum does have capacity to deal with mass volumes of subscribers deploying these new services, in particular streaming. So the big guys want those high-density areas to upload that traffic onto small cell using 355 to 365 spectrum, and probably gobble up some of these PALs, some of these priority access licenses. So there, in those markets, they could be more expensive. However, as the rules are written, no single entity can acquire more than 4 paths. It includes trying to break your company up in different shells or whatever and hide ownership. It's strictly 4 per entity. Someone can come in and grab the entirety of licenses. In addition, there are 7 per census tract, each being 10 megahertz. That's 70 megahertz. Well, its new allocation is 100 megahertz. So there's 30 megahertz that will always be available for general authorized access use. So you'll have a mix of general authorized access and a mix of licensed access with this pile of spectrum. Additionally, if you're in a market, say again, like someplace, rural Nebraska or something, where priority access licenses are not picked up by auction, then that spectrum will automatically revert into the GAA pool. So conceivably have a considerable amount of that total 100 megahertz being completely wide open for general use. The point, there's a lot of spectrum there. If you look at this industry and how they've used spectrum like 5 gigahertz around since the early 90s, and people still deploying a lot of 5 gigahertz today. So 100 megahertz is a humongous amount of spectrum. It gets more interesting when you realize that that spectrum is now globally harmonized with the rest of the world, and we'll get to that in a moment. So the big mobile guys want it for the high-density areas. You are interested in things like a smart grid and basically, data-oriented as well as water companies, waste treatment, that sort of thing. A lot of municipalities that have been expressing interest because they have these increasingly onerous OPEX costs to pay the big companies to connect things like light boards, Amber signs, traffic systems, cameras, even parking meters. The community I live in Florida near St. Petersburg is tons of parking meters. Guess what? Every one of those guys has got a into it and communicates through the Verizon network, then it gets paid for on some monthly fee. I'm not sure what the charge is. Maybe it's $7 to $10 a month. But that adds up. And the cities would love to be able to shed these onerous OPEX contracts, but they have their own spectrum to do it. So comes this new CBRS spectrum, which gives entities like that the ability to build their own private LTE networks and to do it completely protected from interference, just like Verizon can on their core cellular spectrum. That's an astonishing opportunity, especially considering they pick up these licenses for a fraction of what it traditionally costs. So any 8 NTCA members regions are relatively small, so it's conceivable that a few census tracts could be your entire operational footprint. So you have the opportunity for little, maybe a few $1,000 to pick spectrum where you can then operate completely protected, just Verizon, just AT&T. So there's some astonishing opportunity when you think about that. That's why there's so much interest from so many different levels. Worth mentioning here in terms of stakeholders, just because it's something I think you understand, so you can turn it over in your mind. Think about Wi-Fi. Why does anyone, say in healthcare or banking, doing secure transactions or HIPAA-related transactions in healthcare, why does anyone use Wi-Fi? Why do you use it in your offices? There's a reason. You have no choice. It's the only option available to you using basically public spectrum. Guess that would be the case. With CBRS spectrum, if you don't have a license, you'll be able to operate within these GA bands. Remember, the top 50 megahertz, which is the existing 365 to 37, will fall this GA pool as well. So the 30 down below will mean you'll always, at minimum, have 80 megahertz for GAA. So what this means is you're going to find a lot of enterprises using small cell CBRS radio technology to do enterprise what Wi-Fi does today, but to do it with inherently much higher levels of security, lower risks from ambient interference, and if they want to tie into the cellular system because they'll be using small cell. If you really play with that in your mind, you can see that there's some explosive potential into that. Okay, there's that. So what do you have to do on all LTE? Well, I ask the question because you can't ask because you're on mute, I think. But here's a couple things that are really, really important. Nothing to do with vendor or anything else. In the U.S., the 3.5 kind of, or 5.5 range of spectrum has been used and available almost everywhere else in the world since the early 90s. West, most of Asia, Africa, the African continent, New Zealand, Australia, most of Latin America, Central Europe, Russia, everywhere. This spectrum has been available to be used, and in most cases it's been used for kind of fixed wireless technologies. Going back even before the WiMAX days, there were technologies that leveraged bands. So opportunity for global scale already exists, right? Because this is one of the bands that straddles, because of it sits on the spectrum chart. It's not perfect for mobile, but great for fixed, so it straddles both the sides of that coin. It's very attractive for a piece of wireless spectrum, and you found a lot of people deploying back proprietary technologies using those bands to do wireless broadband, especially in markets where you didn't have legacy infrastructure like we have because of the work of telco, like yourselves over the years. So many parts of the world had that legacy infrastructure, so they jumped right to wireless technologies, and they did that principally in this 3.5 band. Global mass is already there, right? So that has been hit and is ready for replanting. Now the U.S. jumps into that pool. So you have entire global harmonization of swath of spectrum. That's ordinarily attractive to vendors, chip makers, and everyone else, because now you have the opportunity for true global mass. Then at the point at which LTE is really reaching inflection points. None of us, every one of us, and everyone listening to my voice right now, sitting by them or in their purse or pocket, is an LTE smartphone. Everyone, LTE is now completely taken over outside of the equation, and it's happening onto the fixed side. LTE technologies are because the early stage of its R&D, there's $1 billion a year that goes into it because its promise of backward compatibility. It's out all these legacy proprietary versions of technology that people have been kind of suffering through and kind of held hostage to limited R&D and all these sort of things. So it turns out is perfectly well suited not just for mobile, but also for fixed. There's nothing that precludes its use in that environment. So you're starting to see it being deployed fixed operations around the world, and actually the U.S. is a little bit behind the curve because like ours, we're kind of jumping into that mix. He created this new piece of spectrum. They like stuff, but you guys in industry are the experts. It's you to come up with the rules for how this SAS, how this board thing is going to work. So she said, okay, fine, we appreciate that. We get better when the government doesn't tell us what to do, enables us, and so they empowered together a group called the Wireless Innovation Forum. Everybody and their brother that's significant in the IT world as well as the telecom world. So whether you're Verizon or whether you're Qualcomm or whether you're Google or Facebook, there are people involved in this forum. What this forum is doing is creating and deciding the rules for this new SAS, the Spectrum Access System, how it works. And Google is one of the companies that is officially registered with the government to provide these services to industry. They very much want to be the Borg, as does another handful of companies that have applied, to include companies like Federated Wireless and a number of others. Being is all the base stations will plug into this Borg. It'll be a kind of a very inexpensive subscription service. But imagine industry achieves the kind of mass that you would see in Wi-Fi, $1 per access point subscription to access the SAS. That adds up into some serious sort of money. How the work that's being done by the wind farm in its is revolving around LTE. Not so much revolving around anything that's proprietary. No one that's in the proprietary space has an ear. So everything is really coalescing around this single standard. Okay? So if you really want to leverage that band, you want to leverage the mass preponderance of devices that will be created in this global market, whether it's bulbs or parking areas or cameras or what it is, the LTE, or else you're not going to be able to play. So there's this new organization that's been formed recently. We joined as shortly behind the charter membership called the CBRS Alliance. Within my own company as on the marketing committee within that, and its job basically is to propagate the use of this piece of spectrum throughout telecom and IT and enterprise communities using LTE. There will be some Wi-Fi, but the principal use and expectation is LTE. So of an economic justification in terms of global mass and all this other sort of thing, but is there any ethical justification for using LTE? I mean, why use something proprietary? There's lots of other things that have been out there from various companies that are basically derived from legacy Wi-Fi, and guess what? They are pretty darn cheap. In fact, they're almost throwaway cheap. So why not use that? Why use LTE at all? Wireless, and if any of you have done it, a couple of you on this call that I know, and I know have, used this little problem of non-line of sight as it relates to obstacles from leaves. Like such a simple thing, right? That, here we are carrying cell phones, and it doesn't really matter whether we're in a forest or we're hiking or anywhere. We can pretty much count on getting some degree of cellular service, some degree of it. But here we are in our world of fixed wireless, and you get a couple trees in the way of legacy technologies, and boom, out go the lights. You can't build a business model on that, especially if you're a local telco, because, your customers expect when the phone is picked up back to your dial tone. It just has to be there. So you burden reliability far higher than any of my friends in the traditional WISP space, the experiential guys, although many of them have truly specialized over the years. So if someone like the NTCA and NTCA members deploying these kinds of services, they operate a technology that can say, connect maybe 40% of those in any given tower footprint. Not going to work. You've got Mrs. Smith that gets connected great, but her next door neighbor, Mr. Johnson, will service, but he can't get it. That scale, that doesn't do anything for your reputation. It just doesn't make any sense. So people have tried to work around problems like this by using frequencies like 900 megahertz, which propagates well through trees, but guess what? It's a fractional allocation, and it's filled with all kinds of other stuff. So, the ability to create high-capacity links just simply isn't there. So, the demands now of the user is really minimum 10 megs dead, right? Because you need roughly 1 or so if you're going to have any kind of serious streaming services. In legacy, things like 900 megahertz, you just can't deliver that. There's just not enough capacity. enough room in that spectrum to do that. Here, LTE, and LTE inherently, because of the advanced nature of the technology, to, even though it's much higher on the spectrum chart, basically the same propagational abilities because of its advanced technology as 900 megahertz, much lower on the spectrum chart. But because of because size, spectrum available in that swath from 355 to 37, 150 megahertz, you can now create large. So not only can you get through the trees like 900 megahertz, but then you can create high-capacity connections similar to what you can do in 5 gigahertz, which is fine for a live site, but doesn't do anything for trees. So LTE, because of the way it works, its sensitivity is much, much greater on a per modulation basis. The way wireless communicates as you go out in distance, you're looking at X modulation, and X modulation may be 54 megabits a second, but if you drill down a little further, drops down to something much lower, and before long, you're down to 2 megs. Well, the trick LTE, it holds its modulation at much lower link levels, so you can cross through boundaries of certain numbers of trees, or half a quarter mile, or whatever it is, depending on the nature of the trees, where other technologies would not be able to establish a link at all. This picture here is an example of what it means. When we talk about non-line of sight, everyone has a different image in their head, because you're born and raised like I was in Virginia, with rolling horse country. You have a much different view of non-line of sight than it is in, down in the draws in Texas, and they're dealing with cottonwoods, or you're in Northern California and you're dealing with sequoias or whatever it is. So this is an example of a link that's about only a mile long, but you can see in the top left, it's crossing a pretty significant numbers of folks really directly in the path. And at the end of the link, you can see a whole bunch of trees in the way. In this industry, a long time. Traditionally, this is a link that you could ever connect with wireless, at least not with any kind of speed. You might be able to do 1 megabit, 2 megabit sort of thing using 900. But now we have a technology that can get through that kind of obstacle and can still deliver excellent throughput, as you down in this particular case, of 53 megs down and about 13 up. So people that have been in this space doing this sort of thing is, frankly, the holy grail of what they've been trying to achieve for a long time. So the long presentation, but I wanted, it was really important that I think everyone understands the CBRS band, because it's going to fundamentally explode this industry. Again, around a long time, the FCC has only opened up spectrum for usage like this very, very seldom over the course of really 20 years in the wireless side of this business. They opened up some in 5 gig, which they used indoor spectrum, and they converted out to outdoor spectrum. They opened up 50 megahertz in this 365 to 37. To do something like that, there's a massive bump in activity. It is wholly different. First, low enough on the spectrum chart, where by nature of its physics, it's pretty decent propagation for physics. You've got global harmonization with the world. 3, have this happening at the inflection point where LTE is taking over, and where the Internet of Things, which is an overused phrase, but it is real, and in the metropolitan area, sure that the Internet of Things does include things like parking meters and SCADA devices and traffic systems and plate readers and all these other sorts of things. So the Internet of Things is real from a metropolitan level already. Because all these things happening, this piece of spectrum really going to revolutionize the space. It's going to create entirely new operators who will then be able to build their own private networks to shed these carrier contracts because they're paying someone else to connect all this stuff until now. If you're an NTCA member, it gives you the ability maybe to get outside your legacy footprint or that footprint using technology that can finally give you kind of carrier-grade reliability without having to pay unbelievably expensive amounts of money for licensed spectrum like in 2.5 or something like that. Because of all this dynamic, I think you can expect the capital markets to open up and expect significant investments. And of course, they're all going to want to do LTE because that's the only word they're ever going to hear. If you're a consultant in this space, expect to see a lot of RFPs from a lot of consultants in the next couple of years. They're all based on LTE because no one is going to know anything else, and frankly, nothing else is going to matter. So the capital communities, because of the fact that people will be able to operate protected networks, interference, protected network, just like a mobile cellular carrier, they will flood into the space to be able to deploy services on kinds of levels. So it's very, very interesting. And you need to look at whether it makes sense in your communities to pick up some of these priority access licensees, the connections to people who understand the space from a legal standpoint. I've got a lot of them in the area that people that are kind of plugged into this world. I can broker those kinds of connections so you can better understand it. But there's a significant opportunity here, and I think you definitely need to take a look at that. And I hope you will consider. If you don't consider LTE, you at least need to be aware of what's happening with this kind of explosion because of the CBRS ban. And I might stop there. That is largely the end of what I have to share.
So I'll remind all of our attendees that questions, just to let us know in the Q&A box in the bottom right, and we'll address those. First, we'll start off with, here's one. When will the CBRS ban kick in, and what's holding it back now?
What's holding it back? What's holding back is industry still has to finish its work on defining the rules of the SAS, and once they do that, the FCC still has to go through the public comment process of auction. They haven't decided exactly how the auction should transpire, although they know it's going to be something non-traditional. For example, it could be something even eBay-like, where there's no requirement to set up a reserve like you have in a traditional auction. So these things have to happen, and they have to go through the public comment period. So given all those things, I would say on the outside, very, very earliest, about probably early 2018, the opportunity exists even today to do experimental networks, because some of these SAS builders, the board builders, have basically baked their SAS, and it's out there for some to test in an experimental way. They want to test lots of different things, for example. They want to test interference management in rural areas, high-density urban areas, all these kinds of things. So there are opportunities for experimental operations.
Option process look like for the CBRS band?
The best we can say is, the educated guess that it will be very different than a traditional auction. Will it be a blind auction? Will it be reserved? These kind of things, no one knows. The things I don't expect there to be small business credits, because the expectation is these licenses are going to go for so cheaply anyway. Yet there are 7,000 census tracts times 7 licenses available in the U.S. So that I think it's quite possible that you'll have some of these things going for as little as a couple $100. In the very first notice of proposed rulemaking back in December of 2012, when they talked about the auction process, described it, envisioning it kind of, their phrasing was an e-bike auction, which I think is very interesting and certainly very doable. Right? So if you quickly just lay it out there, a list of all these census tracts, link, probably a link if you click on it, pulls a Google image of what census tract covers, and then you get to bid on it. I think the process will probably be something along those lines, probably hosted. The government will contract it out to someone like a Google to do it because they have all the tools, and everything else, I think, to make it useful so that you're buying. Also link the Google Maps in the demographic info so you can be as informed as possible. They is really interested in making this spectrum available to the lowest common denominator potential user, not just your traditional users in the cellular world, or even a rural telco kind of guy. They're very interested, even, for example, a local school system or someone else playing this space. So in order to do that, they've got to make the process and information about what all this means. They've got to drill it down to the lowest common denominator. So I actually fully expect something like a Google-based system that will link in, tie into maps and demographic data, and so you can see exactly what you're getting. I think it'll be something like that, and I don't think there'll be a minimum. And I think the auction will be a time basis, and it'll, not just like you have in eBay, and boom, you're either the winner or you're not.
And what is the distinction between LTE on my phone and LTE for fixed wireless?
The funny thing is, to optimize LTE for the fixed side requires a pretty significant effort. Because LTE, unlike WiMAX, which started as a fixed technology, then standards were written to adapt. LTE is the other way around. It's really a technology which companies like us are optimizing to make it suitable for fixed. For example, in mobile world, all our devices, the carrier has to have granular access to how we're each using our sets, or a throttle user A to 5, to 7 down, 1 up, user B to 15 down, 2 up, or whatever it is. In fixed access, operators want much deeper and granular level of visibility in the end user device. So that kind of capability has to be built in. And when I say it, I don't mean non-standard. Just think of it this way: like if you got a Ford F-150 and it's pretty much a standard truck, not a standard track and everything else. What we're talking about is basically installing the auto rack system on top of the pickup, right? So it's basically standards plus a sort of deal. Another one, for example, is a lot of people in this industry like to operate, bridge networks. Obviously, you're not doing that in the mobile world. So implementing Layer 2 and Layer 3 are inherent in the mobile side, so that has to be created. So there's some unique R&D that companies like ours have to do to really optimize it to the fixed space. But you can certainly take these technologies and use them mobile. And really, that's more regulatory barrier and not technology barrier. For example, this 365 barrier, or this CBRS spectrum from 355 to 37, remember that users of this will be small cell, which basically smaller, lower powered devices that your cellular phone connects to. So by definition, it is also a mobile technology. But it'll also be used for fixed.
It looks like that's all the questions we have. So I will thank Patrick Baicells for sharing all this great information with us today. Thanks to all the attendees for coming. This will be made available on the NTCA website. If you have questions, you can follow up. You can contact us or contact Patrick.
Great, and I thank everyone for logging